I wish I wasn't afraid all the time, but I am.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
Hey you guys, this is Professor Vitt. I'm going to whip you guys through Pericles' funeral oration. Remember, this is just a short, brief video. Rather than assign Pericles' funeral oration as something for you to read at home and then we're going to talk about in class, I'm going to go ahead and skip to the chase. We're going to have a small conversation about this piece of literature or this pseudo-philosophical text, whatever, this speech. I want to note a couple of things. First things first, we're going to be starting back in the ancient world. Now, I'll talk in class more about why we're starting back with Greece and so forth. But for now, know that these events take place thousands of years ago. And so I'm not going to thrust us into dates and times. I'm just going to work with the concepts and ideas that are going to be most relevant to our discussion. So, Pericles' funeral oration, what I have here, you'll notice in this header, is a piece of art. And this piece of art is actually a rendering of this speech, what it might have looked like when Pericles gave this oration. The reason why there's a piece of art for this particular funeral oration is that it's such a famous speech. People often compare this speech to the Gettysburg Address. Great, I've got these birds flying through here. People often compare this speech to the Gettysburg Address. It's that great of a speech. Now, the Gettysburg Address takes place at the end of an awful war for the United States, or for America, or however you want to phrase that. But this particular speech takes place at the beginning of a war that is going to be absolutely awful for Athens, and Athens is going to lose. So it's kind of like the pride before the fall, right? This is going to be a speech about a guy who's saying how great this city is. And so the way that we'll cover this information is I'm going to zoom down to highlighted text in the funeral oration itself. I've encouraged you to download this text. First off, right, so we have our little intro. Why are we reading this, right? Why am I reading this? Well, there are four reasons, and the fourth one really relates to the other three. The first one, it tells us about the culture of Athens. And this is important because our first thinkers are going to come from Athens. And remember, it's one thing to have ideas that are out there in our heads, but we have to understand that ideas can influence the world, but the world will also influence our ideas. And so the more we know about the culture in which these ideas take root, the better we're going to be able to understand the nature of the ideas. Number two, this tells us how Athenians, people who lived in Athens many thousands of years ago, viewed themselves and what they thought of themselves and their place in the world. Three, this is going to tell us specifically how Athenians viewed men and women, more specifically how they viewed the relationship or the power dynamic between men and women, at least as it concerns public political life. Fourth, this is going to help us understand the context in which Socrates generates his ideas, Plato generates his ideas, and then Aristotle generates his ideas. Now, there are going to be lots of different kinds of thinkers that come along later, but when it comes to classical political philosophy, which is where we're starting, these are the big three: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So, let's talk first about what someone said concerning the funeral oration of Pericles and the events around the funeral. So Thucydides, this is this guy's name here, you don't need to know him, but he was a general who actually fought in this war. It's called the Peloponnesian War. I'm not going to try to throw too many names at you, but he fought in this war that Athens is about to lose. And so he's telling us about how funerals would proceed in this kind of circumstance. So here he details 3 days before the ceremony, the bones of the dead are laid out in a tent which has been erected, and their friends bring to their relatives such offerings as they please. So we see down here again, any citizen or stranger who pleases joins in the procession, and the female relatives are there to wail at the burial. 5. The dead are laid in the public sepulchre in the most beautiful suburb of the city, and those who fall in war are always buried. Okay, so a couple of points here. Everyone is involved in this, right? This is a big deal. Funerals usually are in culture, and we can see there's a procedure here, there's a procession. Once all of these things are done, right, we carry one empty bier decker for the missing, that is, for those whose bodies could not be recovered. And so there's a huge combination of people who are partaking in this funeral. And then when all of this has been done and the bodies are laid in the earth, a man chosen by the state of approved wisdom and eminent reputation pronounces over them an appropriate da-da-da-da-da-da. Okay, this is what's going to happen. Once they put the coffins in the earth, someone's going to give a speech. And that's what we'll be reading next. So before we get into this, and we know that the person who gets chosen is Pericles, who later becomes a leader for Athens, or is in effect a leader now. Once he gives a speech, we will be reading it down here. Then afterwards, people are done and they disperse. So the speech is really the highlight of a festival or a ceremony that takes a period of days and involves investment from both men and women in the community. It's significant that female relatives are there to wail at the burial because, as we'll see a little bit later, the role of women in public Greek life, certainly politically, is very limited. So any activity that involves the entire community is likely very significant. So my first question here in the text: based on the above description, which of the following statements is true? So Athenians, meaning people who live in Athens, don't really care about their dead. Athenian funerals don't take too long and only 1 or 2 people are involved. Funerals are special events in the community. Athenians place their dead in oak coffins, or Athenians usually don't speak at funerals. Okay. Which of the following is true? C. Athenian funerals are special events in the community. They are a big deal, right? They're very important. And so this helps us understand the gravity of the words that are coming forth. Everybody's involved in this community. It's super important, right? And when you have a city like Athens, which was at the time the most prosperous city in its region, perhaps the world, but maybe not, this is a very tight-knit community. So now, Pericles is going to start his speech here, and it's absolutely wonderful, and I encourage you all to read it, but I'm going to just spit right here to this first open paragraph that I've got that reads, "I will speak first of our ancestors, for it is right and seemly that now, when we are lamenting the dead, a tribute should be paid to their memory." And then he goes on, and he talks about the people who helped to found Athens, right? And that their valor has been handed down from generation to generation, and we've received from these wonderful ancestors a free state, okay? And so what is important about this is Pericles thinks that we should really honor the dead for the contributions to the city, but also tradition is incredibly important to Athens. And so it's who you are is not just who Pericles sees himself as being is not just one person now who's made Athens great. He says, no. It's our traditions. And it's the people who have come before us. And so we give homage to that. Now, this is important because, as we'll see later, tradition becomes very important for certain elements of what we would call modernly conservative thought, right? So Athens is fantastic, but the reason it's fantastic has to do with its traditions and its ancestors. That's point number 2. All right, now, at this point, we're going to move on to Pericles discussing the Athenian form of government, right? So he says, our form of government does not enter into rivalry with the institutions of others. Our government does not copy our neighbors, but is an example to them. It is true that we are called a, wait for it, democracy. For the administration is in the hands of the many and not of the few. But while there exists equal justice for all, And alike in their private disputes, the claim of excellence is also recognized. So a couple of things here. Pericles identifies Athens as a democracy in which there exists equal justice for all. So the form of government in Athens is a democracy, and he also tells us here, our government does not copy our neighbors, but is an example to them. And he's absolutely right. Athens was so unique in the ancient world because it had this democratic form of government. Its rival, Sparta, was not a democracy. It was probably closer to an oligarchy, and it was much more of a military state than Athens was. So you can see already the form of government for Athens is a democracy. Now I want to just point out one thing here. This sentence here where he reads, while we are thus unconstrained in our private business, a spirit of reverence pervades our public acts. We are prevented from doing wrong by respect for the authorities and for the laws. This is not a police state. People willingly consent to be governed here, and that's a huge deal, right? And somehow this form of government, Pericles thinks, leads Athens to be an example to all of the world, right? So he says here, because of the greatness of our city, the fruits of the whole earth flow in upon us so that we enjoy the goods of other countries as freely as our own. Okay. Now, a couple of other points here. Our homes are beautiful and elegant, right? Do Athenians think that their city is great? Yeah, they think their city is the greatest city on the planet. They think they are the best, right? This is called ethnocentrism, a big name for something like, we're better than anyone else, and we eat awesome cake, right? And this is very much Athens' viewpoint. They think that they are the greatest in the world, and nothing can stop them, nothing can prevent them from doing what they want to do until, spoiler alert, something will bring Athens down, and it'll be an awful fall, right? Think about the bigger they come, the harder they fall, right? Well, it's true here, right? Athens is arrogant about their prosperity and where the cause of their prosperity and their dominance and their place in the world. Okay, so now we're zooming through a bunch of absolutely wonderful and poetic and interesting language, because we're now going to try to talk about, this is again real briefly, gender and the role of women in political life in Athens. Now, if you recall at the very beginning of this, I said, women participate, Thucydides told us, that women participate in the funerals they wail on behalf of male relatives and so forth. Now, Pericles devotes 2 lines in the entire oration to women. And one of those is him just giving a transition that he's going to start talking about women. So let's get to this. On the other hand, if I must say anything on the subject of female excellence to those of you who will now be in widowhood, it will be all comprised in this brief exhortation. So he's saying, so if I'm going to talk about women, I'm just going to say it real briefly right here. And this is the quote. Great will be your glory in not falling short of your natural character made by God. And the greatest glory of a woman is to be least talked about by men, whether they are praising you or criticizing you. Okay, that last sentence. Which of the following statements is the best translation of that immediately above sentence? A, women should be seen and not heard. B, the less we talk about women, the better. C, women are inferior to men by virtue of God's design. And the answer is D. All of these are pretty close, right? It's hard to read Pericles' funeral oration and draw any other conclusion that women are marginalized with regard to political activity in the community. And so this leads us into our number 6. Based on the last quote, what do you think the Greeks thought of women? They don't see women as equal to men. They see men and women as equal, right? They don't see men and women as equal in any sense. In fact, there's a lot to suggest, certainly with thinkers like Aristotle, that Aristotle thinks that women are, in effect, defective, right? That they're wrong. They're inferior in some way to men. Now, this is important to us for a couple of reasons. One, traditionally in political philosophy, certainly in the classical period and as we move forward, the role of women in governance has been severely curtailed and abridged by men who had power and were not going to relinquish it. This will help us appreciate how radical Plato is in his thought. And so when Plato makes claims about the roles of women in politics, it will help you appreciate, wow, by those lights, by the lights of the people who were his contemporaries, you will say, yeah, Plato must have been crazy. They must have thought he was absolutely crazy, and they did. So I'm just going to go through this one more time. I'm going to highlight some big banging points that we can just remember as we move into our next lecture. So here we go. First, Pericles' funeral oration. We're reading it. It is an incredibly famous funeral oration. It's a famous speech. It's always listed in the world's greatest speeches or the most influential of all time. Beautiful piece of writing, and even more beautiful if you ever read it in the classical Greek, which I have not. Okay, Thucydides discussing the funeral. The funeral requires all of the community, and it's an important cultural event. The next thing, Pericles thinks that tradition is very important, and although Athens is a democracy, the role of tradition in Athens is quite strong. 3, Athens is a democracy, and it is uniquely a democracy in the history of the world. There aren't other democracies around at the time, and this idea, the uniqueness of Athens, makes Athenians feel very strongly that their city is great, and they owe this greatness to their form of government and the efforts of their ancestors. And then the last 2 points, not to be minimized, the role of women politically and otherwise in Greek life is highly curtailed compared to our own. And so essentially Greeks think that women shouldn't be doing much and they shouldn't be mentioned very much. Now to many of this is repugnant, right? This is just flat out wrong. But again, this will help us understand later theorists like Plato and why they're so revolutionary. Okay, you guys, that actually does it. You are done. You are ready to come to class and talk about the next section in our readings, and that's going to be something that I'll surprise you with, but I'll give you a hint. It's going to be the apology. Okay, you guys, I will see you on Wednesday. Hope you have a great weekend, and I hope this video wasn't too long. Bye. Stay cool. Fight.